Sure.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Danielle Laurier, the president of the Brockville and District Horticultural Society. And it's great to have so many people tune in for a TikTok tonight. Before asking Gwen to introduce our speaker, if you join by Zoom, could you please turn off both your mic and your video? This during the presentation. It helps reduce the noise, and it helps also with the bandwidth that the meeting is on. So once we have done that, I will ask Gwen to introduce our speaker. Gwen?
Hi, thank you, Danielle. My name is Gwen Guerin. Tonight, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Katie Clow, who is an assistant professor at the University of Guelph. She grew up in the Brockville area and still has family here. And she has both a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and her PhD in pathobiology. And her area of expertise focuses on the epidemiology of vectors with a specific emphasis on the black-legged tick and Lyme disease. So here is Katie to give her tick talk. Welcome, Katie.
Great. Thank you for having me. Yes, as Gwen mentioned, Brockville is my hometown. So I was delighted to be invited. And I also love gardening. So I think we're a group of like-minded people. I have been, just as the conversation went, I've been itching to get out, but I also don't want to disturb all those pollinators and everything. But I don't have 15 acres, so all of my stuff goes in the compost. Can everyone see my screen? I see a shaking of heads. Awesome.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So tonight, as it's titled, we're going to talk about ticks. And as was discussed at the intro, this is a pretty opportune time to be talking about ticks. With this nice warm weather, they're going to be crawling out of their winter slumber and are very hungry. And we have what they want. So this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about just ticks and tick-borne diseases in Ontario to give you sort of an overview. And then most of the talk will focus on Lyme disease and the ecology of Lyme disease and the black-legged tick, because right now that's sort of our biggest threat here in Ontario, and I think probably what a lot of people are interested in. And then we'll finish up with some tick bite prevention, both for people and pets, because I'm a vet and I think pet tick prevention is equally as important. So if you look on this photo here, my mouse took me backwards. This is a black-legged tick, which some of you may have seen. So this is an unfed tick, but this is an adult female. She has this round scutum on her back. So the dark brown part is her scutum. And then that sort of dark reddish brown and these long palps, which are her feeding parts. So this is a very characteristic appearance of a black-legged tick. And you'll notice that the scutum, so that dark brown circle on top, doesn't have any patterning. So that's an important part of recognizing a black-legged tick as well. And I'll show you some different images. So jumping into the current context in Ontario, worldwide, we have over 900 species of ticks. Fortunately, we don't have that many in Canada. We actually have about 30 to 40 species of ticks in Canada alone, though, so still a fair number. We don't talk about a lot of them because many are very host specific. They like to feed on a certain type of rabbit or a certain seabird, and we never see them on ourselves. They don't carry any pathogens that make us sick, and so we don't really care too much about them. But the ones that are very common, I've put up here on the slide. And so the black-legged tick has been the one that has been changing a lot and sort of emerging into Ontario and areas of Canada. We used to not have these guys around. If we go back to the 1990s, there was a population at Long Point, Ontario, and that was about it. And since then, we've seen a lot of spread across Ontario, and I'm going to talk about some of those reasons why. On the left-hand side, we have an American dog tick, which you can see that the image is kind of shiny, but the scutum on these guys' back, so that circle on their back, is patterned. And so that's if you're trying to differentiate black-legged ticks versus American dog ticks, which are the most common ones you're going to encounter, that can be a helpful hint for you. American dog ticks, as the name goes, they love to feed on dogs, and we predominantly see them in the spring. Versus the black-legged ticks, I'll show you, we see them in the spring, a little in the summer, and then a lot in the fall. And then on the right-hand side, we have groundhog ticks, which we occasionally see on people. They're more common in sort of, well, in sort of the Ottawa area and then into Quebec and New Brunswick. We get, if we're collecting submissions, we get lots of groundhog ticks then. We don't see them that often because, as the name says, they like groundhogs, and they actually sort of typically are found sort of around the groundhog's nest. So they don't kind of go out and look for people. And then the rabbit tick is another common wildlife tick. We don't see them again very much on people, but if we go out and we're looking for ticks in the field, we do get them quite a bit. And they're, as the name says, they like to feed on rabbits. And so we see them quite a bit in sort of our forested areas. There's a couple of ticks that you're going to hear a lot about that we don't usually find in Ontario. So you've probably heard in the media a lot about the Lone Star tick. And that one is recognizable because she has a dot on her back, which apparently is a star, but it really doesn't look like a star, but it's an easy way to remember it. Right, these ticks are found predominantly in the United States. So they used to be sort of south central United States. Their range, or where they've been found, has spread sort of across the northeastern seaboard of the United States. We have introductions of these ticks usually on an annual basis on wildlife and birds. But right now, based on all the sort of surveillance and monitoring we do, we don't think we have any of these guys that are established and breeding in Ontario. We do know, though, that our habitat and climate is supportive of these ticks. And so we do continue to monitor them because we know they could have a risk of establishing. And then the brown dog tick, which is on the right-hand side, I see them a lot because I'm a veterinarian, and these guys, as the name says, they love to feed on dogs, particularly dogs that are in sort of tropical areas. And so we see them brought up on dogs if they've traveled or they've been adopted from sort of warmer climates and then brought into Canada. This is the one tick species that can form infestations in homes, which is why they're usually an issue when they're brought in on a dog. But we don't think we have the climate that's conducive to these ticks, and so we don't find them naturally in our environment. It's only if they're introduced. And so thinking about why we care about ticks, there's long lists of tick-borne pathogens, or pathogens I'm using as a word to be bacteria and viruses and parasites, so anything that can cause disease that these ticks can carry. In Ontario, our predominant worry is the black-legged tick, and I've starred Lyme disease there. And so Borrelia burgdorferi is the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and black-legged ticks can transmit that to people and dogs and horses. Black-legged ticks can also carry pathogens that cause babesiosis, Powassan fever, anaplasmosis, and a relapsing type fever. And there's a few others that are added to that list as well. We see these much rarer in Ontario. As we call it, the infection prevalence, or the percentage of ticks that are detected with these bacteria, are a lot less than the Lyme disease bacteria. But we have seen some changes in anaplasmosis, and Powassan fever is one that sort of pops up in spots, and we don't know a lot about it still. The dog tick, which we see a lot in Ontario, is a little bit of an anomaly because in the States, we know that it can cause a variety of different diseases. But in Ontario, we routinely test these ticks and we don't find anything in them. So that's really great. We don't have a lot of really good reasons to explain that difference. But it's good news for now that right now these ticks, although they're annoying and they can bite you, and they, especially our dogs, they can lead to big infestations if the dogs aren't treated with anything. We don't see a lot of bacteria or parasites in them, and so their risk for disease is quite a lot lower. And we continue to monitor that because we don't know if that's going to change. And then the groundhog tick can also carry the virus that causes Powassan fever. And so just before I jump into a little bit more on Lyme disease, just to give you a little background on how we study ticks. So tick collection and monitoring and surveillance that health units and researchers do usually is divided into two things. So we have passive surveillance programs, which many of you may have participated in the past, where if you find a tick, you submit it. A lot of those programs have changed over the years, particularly in areas like Brockville and Eastern Ontario, where there's just so many ticks now that they've changed the way that they're monitoring things. And then they switched to a lot more active surveillance, which is when people like myself or public health inspectors go out in the woods. They look kind of crazy. You have a white flannel blanket and you drag the vegetation for ticks. And this is a really good way to know if there's ticks that are in that environment. You can estimate the density of the population. You can capture a bunch of different types of ticks if there's multiple species there. And so we use this technique routinely in my research. And it's also a nice way to spend the day in the woods. And then a lot of the ticks that we collect end up going for tick testing. And this is to see what kind of bacteria or viruses might be present in those ticks. And a lot of times people used to send ticks away hoping that they would get an answer if that tick had bitten them. But routinely, tick testing actually isn't used for clinical diagnosis. And the recommendations now on both the human side and the veterinary side is that tick testing for delays, and there's a lot of reasons that it doesn't really tell you if you're going to get sick or not. And so we use tick testing to look at tick populations and know what risks are in the area. And so it can be really helpful for risk assessment and for public health, but it's not particularly useful in sort of determining the clinical approach for a person or an animal. So now I'm going to jump into our next section of the presentation, which is digging a bit deeper into Lyme disease. And so Lyme disease has a pretty interesting history, if you like history. So it does get its name from Lyme, Connecticut. And it was in the early 1970s that they started noticing an increase in the number of cases of childhood arthritis, which, if you think about it, children can get arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, but usually that doesn't happen in an epidemic. Like, you shouldn't be noticing multiple cases of this within an area. And the epidemiologists and doctors had conversations with a lot of these parents, and the one thing that they realized was that these kids were all out playing in the woods, and in the woods there were ticks. And so in the early 1970s, they made the connection between this disease, which they called Lyme disease, and these ticks in the woods. It wasn't until about 10 years later that a scientist actually discovered the bacteria in the tick that was causing this disease. And then over time, with some of our fancy molecular methods, they were able to determine that, the black-legged tick and the bacteria that causes Lyme disease weren't actually new in that time of history. They could be traced back thousands and thousands of years. But what they were able to learn is that when the settlers came to North America, for agricultural reasons, they removed a lot of the trees and forests so that they could make their farms. And they hunted a lot of white-tailed deer, and many of those populations ended up being decimated and just sort of hid away in places where there weren't a lot of people. But in the 1950s, they started to reforest a lot of areas of the United States, sort of in an environmental effort to build back some of those forests. And a lot of hunting bylaws were brought in so that some of the white-tailed deer populations could recover. And so with that, you have forested habitat, which is where these ticks thrive. as well as white-tailed deer, which are really important hosts for ticks to feed on. And so with that came back the tick population, and then the disease started appearing again. And so if we think just really basically about what Lyme disease is, so it's caused by a bacterial spirochete, and they call it a spirochete because it's like a spiral. And so if you look on the right-hand side, that's a fancy image of what the spirochetes look like. The predominant place where this bacteria sort of resides in nature, ticks pick it up, and then ticks will take it and transmit it to another place, are white-footed mice and other small mammals. And so we think of white-footed mice, short-tailed shrews, masked shrews, and eastern chipmunks as being pretty good reservoirs for this bacteria. And so essentially the bacteria is in their bloodstream, a tick will feed on them, pick up the bacteria, and then the tick's gonna go feed on another reservoir, and then that white-footed mouse is now carrying the bacteria, and the cycle kind of continues. The vector is the tick that we've been talking about, so nymphal and adult stages of the black-legged tick. And so I'll show you that there's 4 stages of the black-legged tick. They're hatched into eggs, then they develop into larvae, which is the baby stage, then they develop into nymphs, which is sort of the teenager tick, and then there's adult male and female. And research has shown that the mom tick doesn't pass the bacteria to the eggs, or if she does, it's in extraordinarily small amounts. And so the only way that a tick can actually become infected with the bacteria again is if it feeds on a reservoir host. And ticks only feed once per life stage. They take a really big meal, and then they go have a giant sleep and transition into their next life stage. And so they're only going to pick it up when they feed, and they can only transmit it in the next life stage. So the nymphal and adults are our highest risk. Our susceptible species are humans, being the most susceptible, and then less commonly dogs and horses. And I'll touch on that in a second. And so for clinical disease to develop, we need a specific set of conditions per se. So the tick that bites you has to be a black-legged tick. It has to be infected. And so the number of ticks, or the percentage of ticks that are infected, very much varies by geographic region. But in Eastern Ontario is a hot spot. And so, we've done surveillance where 30, 40, 50% or more of the ticks can be infected. And so in that case, we kind of make the assumption that if a tick bites you, there's a very high likelihood that it is infected. And then we need adequate feeding time. And so this is something that is unique to each pathogen that a tick carries. And it's a little complicated because it depends on where the bacteria actually lives in the tick. So the bacteria that causes Lyme disease lives in the gut of the tick. And then as the tick takes a blood meal, so it bites in and starts feeding on blood, then that bacteria has to migrate all the way up into the salivary glands, and that takes time. It undergoes these weird protein changes. And so that takes about 24 hours to happen. And so if you're wondering where that sort of, if you've heard 24 hours as sort of this magical time, it's actually not that magical. It has to do with the bacteria actually migrating up into the salivary glands, and there's lots of lab studies to show that. But the thing is that, as I said, that's pathogen dependent. And so if we take Powassan fever, on the other hand, which is also carried by the black-legged tick, that one's really quick. So that pathogen actually lives in the salivary glands of the tick. And so as it bites you, it can transmit. And they've shown transmission times to be around 15 minutes. And so that's a little scary because that's sort of immediate, versus with Lyme disease, you have a little bit of time to do your tick check and find your tick and remove it as quickly as possible. So that feeding time comes into conversation when we will talk about tick prevention and the value of doing tick checks. So in humans, disease is usually acute, meaning it presents pretty quickly after a tick bite, usually within 2 weeks. But those signs can be really non-specific. I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have huge expertise in human Lyme disease, but generally it's sort of, you feel unwell, flu-like symptoms, you might get this sort of bullseye rash that's on the left, right-hand side, and looks like a sort of target or bullseye. But it depends on where a tick bites you and where that rash is if you see it. So if a tick bites you on your scalp, you're probably not going to be able to see that rash. And so it's helpful if you do see it, but it's not sort of a guarantee. Ideally, we want to catch the disease early because then it will disseminate. And I'm sure many of you have heard of stories of people who have suffered from the more late disseminated disease where it can affect your joints and your heart. And, you know, sometimes those symptoms can be challenging to recognize as well. And in humans, a big proportion of those that are bitten do develop clinical signs. If we flip to dogs now, dogs are sort of almost a little bit opposite of what we see in humans, which is quite interesting. So disease in dogs is typically chronic. So we don't usually see Lyme disease pop up in canines until like 3 to 5 months after a tick bite. So quite different than in humans. And the other flip side is that a lot of dogs are exposed to the bacteria, but they never get sick. So about 95% of those that have exposure, and we can see that through a blood test, they never develop clinical signs. That being said, we do like to monitor dogs closely for this. And so characteristic signs of Lyme disease in dogs are, again, not doing well. So they might be off their feed, they might be really tired. And the other really characteristic thing we see is a shifting lameness. So they might be sore on one leg one day and then sore on a different leg the next day. And you're kind of like, well, that seems weird because they couldn't have injured one and then the next day. So that's a little bit of a clue, particularly for veterinarians. There is a rare sort of consequence of Lyme disease in dogs that can actually affect their kidneys, and it can be fatal. It is very rare, but we pay attention to it in veterinary medicine. And so if a dog has exposure to Lyme disease, we like to monitor them a bit more to make sure that everything is fine and there's no signs of kidney disease. So in Ontario, the Public Health Ontario does a lot of surveillance. They go out and tick drag every year, and they produce this really helpful map. And so this is the 2020 map. And I was talking to my colleague in public health, and the 2021 map is going to be out pretty soon. And how they design these maps is the yellow areas are what we call estimated risk areas. And so to become a risk area, someone has to go out with their fancy tick blanket and drag there, and they have to find at least one tick in the spring and in the fall. And then that area is declared a risk area, and then they put a 20-kilometer radius around that site because we know that ticks move, wildlife moves, and so there could be ticks in that surrounding area. And so it's been interesting and sort of scary to watch these maps change. I think they go back to 2015 or 2016. And certainly we've seen a lot of change in Eastern Ontario. And so as you can see, pretty much the St. Lawrence Valley and into the Lake Ontario area is a risk area. And then the Ottawa Valley and up into Renfrew County has really just emerged within the last couple of years. Another key place where we've seen growing tick populations is actually in the GTA and sort of northward, even up into sort of Barrie and Orillia. And even though these are, we'll talk about that, these are ticks that we generally find sort of in wooded and brushy areas. They found a lot of ticks sort of in the Rouge Valley of Toronto and then up northward because there's sort of corridors of suitable habitat. And then there's other places sort of just along the north shores of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Turkey Point and Long Point have had tick populations for quite a while. If we look at this map, one sort of thing that always jumps out at me is if we think about habitat in these areas, if we think about Eastern Ontario is beautiful. There's lots of forested areas, lots of lakes, lots of wildlife, which is what we all love that, right? But that's really conducive to black-legged tick habitat. Versus if we go into Southern Ontario and I think about driving the 401 corridor from Guelph down to London, down to Windsor, it's a really boring drive. It's all agricultural field, not that like agricultural field is great, but it's all very flat, not forested, very dry. And so a lot of those areas are not great for black-legged ticks, and we haven't seen the same sort of population explosion in southern Ontario versus sort of eastern Ontario. Okay, so now I'm going to try and tie a few of these pieces together and show you a little bit about disease ecology, and why we've seen changes in these tick populations and allow us to understand disease patterns a bit better. And this is something that I find really fascinating because like the image I put on the screen, it is just like a big puzzle. And so disease ecology looks at a lot of different factors, whether they're sort of the abiotic factors of the environment. So we're thinking temperature, humidity, and precipitation. And then the biotic factors, so we're thinking habitat characteristics, and then different host populations, or, you know, wildlife, dogs, humans, things that ticks can feed on. And essentially, we want to know what factors really support tick populations and therefore allow for them to spread and thrive and then lead to us to see new disease patterns. And so the black-legged tick, as I mentioned, has 4 life stages. So larvae are about the size of a pin dot. You probably won't see them. I can see them under a microscope, but they're very hard to see otherwise. They have 6 legs, and so that's how we can easily characterize them as a larva. And then the nymphs, and then the adult females and adult males have 8 legs, and you can see sort of that characteristic picture of the adult female here. And then the nymphs are about the size of a sesame seed, so they're pretty small. And then of course they can double, triple in size as they feed. This is a graph that illustrates some of the patterns that I had previously talked about. So phenology is a fancy word for saying that the different life stages of the black-legged tick are active in different seasons. And we see characteristic patterns every year, you know, and there's always sort of annual variations depending on the climate and the conditions. But generally in the spring and then in the fall, so starting probably now, we've had some nice warm weather into April and May. This is when we're going to see our adults active. And so these are ones that have overwintered. They were active in the fall. They didn't have a blood meal. So they come back out in the spring and they're really hungry. Then once the weather warms up a bit more, come into June, this is when we start to see the nymphs active. And so June into early July is peak nymph season. And this is the season that we worry about the most for human disease risk, because nymphs can transmit the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and they're also active when we're out in shorts and a t-shirt, excited that it's summer and it's no longer winter, and so we're not as covered up. And nymphs are super tiny, and so they're harder for us to see than the adult life stage. And so if you've ever heard that sort of nymphs pose the biggest risk for Lyme disease, that's the reason why. It's sort of a combination between biological factors and human activity, creating sort of that perfect exposure time. Once we get into the hot summer months where it's hot and dry, we don't see much tick activity for black-legged ticks. Every species of tick has a different phenology, and so this is specific to the black-legged tick. And so usually by late August, early September, that's when the eggs will hatch and we'll see lots of larvae. But we don't worry about these guys very often. We don't find them on humans. The fancy word that we say sitting and waiting for a blood meal is called questing. And so they usually are very low to the ground, and they generally feed on things that are quite small, like small rodents. Then once we get into October and November, sometimes into December, depending on how warm it stays, we do see another peak in adults, and it's usually bigger than the peak that we see in the spring. So adult can be really high tick time, so the fall can be really high adult tick time. And so if we're thinking about factors that influence some of these patterns and why we're seeing ticks, climate is a big one. And so temperature and humidity are two of the most crucial things to a tick and its development and its activity. And we particularly think sort of on the microclimate level, so at the tick level. So ticks live predominantly in the leaf litter layer of the forest, which is where they can stay nice and moist, and where they can also stay warm and protected from the snow in the winter. So even if we have a really nasty winter, it doesn't usually get rid of tick populations because they're down protected in the leaf litter. When the temperatures are warmer, so many of you have probably heard this sort of magical 4 degrees Celsius. I don't use that often because I find that sort of a hard number. And because the microclimate of the tick is so important, the temperature sort of on the forest floor can be quite different than what we experience and what the weather network tells us. And so what I like to tell people is, as soon as the temperatures are above freezing, we need to start thinking about ticks. That way it gives us a little wiggle room. And essentially, you know, the snow is melting, it's a warmer day, we need to be worrying about ticks becoming active. And temperature is important for ticks because the warmer it is, the faster they develop. So they have to go, essentially they feed, they take their blood meal, then they go into sort of a quiet period, and they're going to develop from one life stage to the next quicker the warmer the temperatures. And that's important for a number of reasons. One, it helps them grow their populations quicker because they're developing faster, they're reproducing, and then their populations flourish. Another reason that's really important is because ticks need to have temperatures of a certain level for a long enough period of time for them to undergo development. And so if temperatures are really cold, if we think of, you know, areas quite a bit north of us, their summers are shorter. And so a tick only has a certain amount of time it can be active and feeding for. And it actually ends up starving because the temperatures aren't warm enough for long enough for it to be able to feed enough and develop and then go into the next life stage and feed again. And so generally in more northern areas, ticks die off because the temperatures just don't allow them to feed and reproduce quick enough. And so I'm going to come back to that when we talk a little bit about climate change. Temperatures are also important for the ticks' questing activity. So like I said, ticks live in that leaf litter layer of the forest, and they're going to climb up onto vegetation, so grasses, sort of brushy material, all of that sort of understory in the forest is where they're going to climb up, and they essentially wait for something to come along. They can sense temperature and carbon dioxide, and then they latch onto a host. They're pretty lazy. And so when the temperatures are a little bit lower, but the humidity is high, that's when we're going to see the biggest amount of questing. So if we're thinking sort of earlier in the morning and then later in the afternoon, probably the times when we also like to be outside. Climate is also important sort of if we think about bigger climate factors. And we can kind of think about all parts of the tick life stage. So drought is one of the things that's been linked to decreased tick abundance. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, humidity is so important to these ticks. And so, as I said, temperature is really important and humidity is really important. And if it gets too dry, they dry out and they die. And if it's too dry, they don't come out and look for a blood meal. And then essentially they're going to starve because they haven't gotten any food. And so when we see drought, we see lower amounts of ticks. And this is also impacts because drought usually affects everything else, right? It's going to affect the habitat that they live in and the hosts that they feed on. And so it's sort of a double whammy to tick populations when it's really dry for an extended period of time. And so there's lots of discussion, particularly in the media, about the impact of climate change on ticks and tick-borne diseases. And these maps just sort of show over time how many areas of Canada will become suitable for the black-legged tick. So red is strong suitability, and then the orange is is still reasonable suitability. And so, as I said, if with climate change, we're having warmer temperatures, essentially more northern areas are now warmer for a long enough period of time that these tick populations can survive, reproduce, and thrive in an area. And so that's one of the reasons over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen this ongoing range expansion of black-legged ticks into many areas of Canada. They were previously not suitable for long-term survival of these tick species, but now they're just that little bit warmer, these ticks can thrive in those areas and develop strong populations. And these theories and research exists for other tick species, including the Lone Star tick, which we know with climate change, many areas of Ontario, particularly where we live, could become suitable for these tick species. The other thing that's really critical for black-legged ticks, and I've already touched on this a little bit, is thinking about its habitat. And so this ties in directly to thinking about climate. And so if we think about temperature and humidity being the key things for survival for these ticks, then a forested habitat is what gives them some of that really suitable climate. And so the leaf litter layer is nice and moist. And so that's where ticks spend about 98% of their life. They undergo development in the leaf litter layer, and they rehydrate in the leaf litter layer and spend most of their time there. The other thing about forested habitats is that they also provide really good access to the hosts that ticks want to feed on. And so these, again, small mammals and white-tailed deer. And so it's a sort of a perfect combination of different factors. In Ontario, the first few sort of established areas where we saw black-legged ticks were particularly Carolinian forests. So sort of those beautiful mixed forests in southern Ontario. We now, as we track tick population expansion, they are in many other areas than just the Carolinian forest range, and certainly up into eastern Ontario and the Ottawa Valley, where typically the Carolinian forest, we're into a different area of forest. And so they've just sort of been able to survive in different habitats. But again, it's that sort of forested area and then surrounding brushy area. So particularly, if you live in a rural property and have some nice shrub areas and all sorts of sort of vegetation around that area, ticks like to thrive in those places as well. We don't see this species of tick particularly on like mowed grass. So if you hear people saying, keep your grass and everything clean and your yard well maintained, because these ticks dry out so quickly, they're not going to be thriving in sort of that mowed grass area. But those areas that surround the forest and then into the forest are particularly high risk. For the black-legged tick, we think of hosts, and I'm saying hosts as things that it feeds on and gets blood from. We're not up there. We're sort of an incidental host for black-legged tick. They prefer to feed on these guys, but if they're hungry, they're going to feed on whatever they can find. And for us, we pass the bill, we have blood, and so they feed on us. If we think about sort of the natural cycle, birds, small mammals, and white-tailed deer are important for the black-legged tick, and these are each for different reasons. And so for small mammals, I had already mentioned that these guys are important because they're reservoirs for the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and they're actually reservoirs for a number of other tick-borne bacteria. Ticks love to feed on small mammals, particularly in their subadult stages, so the larvae and the nymphs. And it's estimated that about 80 to 90% of all black-legged ticks are infected by 4 species of small mammals. So those are our white-footed mice, our short-tailed shrews, our masked shrews, and our eastern chipmunks. Our white-footed mice are really competent reservoirs. And one thing that makes them such a good host for ticks and also allows for the bacteria to thrive and go through transmission cycles between ticks and different habitats One, these guys are habitat generalists, so we find them all over the place, and they seem to survive in even sort of not great forested areas, places that are really unbiodiverse. White-footed mice still do well. They're also really permissive. And so this means that a bunch of ticks will be feeding on them and they don't care. They just let them feed and they don't actively groom them off. And if you think about ticks needing to get a blood meal to develop, and also ticks needing to feed long enough to pick up the bacteria or transmit the bacteria, this sort of permissive property is actually really important for both tick development and bacterial transmission. You may have heard sort of about opossums and ticks, and opossums are the opposite. So they're not permissive at all. Opossums hate ticks, and they will actively groom any ticks that are on them and kill them. But for some reason, ticks still really like opossums. So we call them sort of this tick sink, where a lot of ticks can be trapped and killed on opossums, and just part of a natural cycle. The funny thing I usually get, though, is people asking if we should, introduce a lot of opossums into our environment. And, usually playing with nature like that is never a particularly good idea. There's always other consequences. But it's just sort of interesting to see how different hosts tolerate ticks differently. And then we come to the white-tailed deer, which I always feel a little bit bad for because they always get a bad name when we talk about Lyme disease. And the reason why is that adult ticks love to feed on white-tailed deer. And so you can have huge burdens of adult ticks, male and female, on white-tailed deer. And a lot of breeding of ticks actually occurs on white-tailed deer. So the males will find the females on the deer, breed, and then the female can have a big enough blood meal so that she can develop her eggs. And so white-tailed deer are really important for allowing for tick populations to thrive and reproduce and grow. The one thing that white-tailed deer have nothing to do with is actually the cycle of bacteria. And so white-tailed deer are not competent for the bacteria. They actually have what we call borreliocidal blood. So when the bacteria gets in there, the white-tailed deer can get rid of it. But because they're so important to tick populations, we kind of can't remove them from the Lyme disease cycle because we need really good tick populations to then have Lyme disease present. And so deer kind of get caught in this. It's really not great for them, right? They can have hundreds to thousands of ticks feeding on them. And in some of those cases, there can be, production deficits and significant loss of blood when that many ticks are feeding on you. So it's really not fun for them either. And then the last host I'm going to talk about is thinking about migratory birds. So migratory birds have one of the most interesting roles actually in sort of the Canadian story of black-legged tick expansion. So black-legged ticks they feed on a number of bird species. These are usually ground foraging and ground nesting species because ticks, they can't move very far. They don't climb up very high on the vegetation. And so these guys are at their level and they will feed on them. And if you think about, a bunch of songbirds migrating up from the southern United States into Canada every spring, they're going to stop in places where there's lots of black-legged ticks in the eastern United States, pick up a few ticks, and then, ticks feed for 4 to 7 days. And so on a migratory bird in 4 to 7 days, a tick can travel a huge distance. And so studies have shown that there's somewhere between 50 to 175 million ticks introduced every year on migratory birds. So that's not an insignificant number. And so it depends kind of what life stage is introduced based on the migratory flyway that these guys are taking. But essentially, tons and tons of ticks are brought up into Canada every year on migratory birds. And so a lot of these ticks don't survive. Again, they need to be they need to come off of a place where the habitat and hosts and climate are conducive to their survival. But how this sort of fits together with other things I've talked about is migratory bird migration is nothing new, right? Like this has been happening for thousands of years. And so ticks being brought up on migratory birds isn't new. But what is new is that as our climate warms and more northern areas are becoming suitable for these ticks, we have a really great mechanism of dispersal of just continually bringing ticks in and allowing these populations to thrive now that the climate is suitable. So the pieces kind of fit together there. So this diagram just sort of ties everything together that I was talking about and is helpful to understand when risk for you and I and our pets is the highest. And so generally eggs are laid in the spring and they're gonna hatch in the summer. And so I said that larvae are generally active in August and September. And these guys are predominantly feeding on our ground foraging birds and our small mammals. And we don't find them very often on ourselves or our pets. Those guys overwinter and in the spring, so we're thinking sort of late May, June, July, these guys are, they develop into nymphs. And nymphs is what I had said was our greatest risk. So they're active when we're active, when we're probably not wearing as many layers, and they have the ability to transmit the bacteria, and they're really small. And so they're harder for us to recognize. And so when nymphs are active, that's when risk is high for us. Once nymphs have fed, they go into their quiet period and they develop into adults, which are active in the fall. Adults are also a risk to us. They can carry the bacteria. They like to feed on bigger things. So we find them typically on humans and dogs. They're a little bit bigger, so that helps us with our tick checks and noticing them, but certainly risk is still high from adults as well. And then the cycle sort of starts all over again. And so this is just a nice diagram to put some of those pieces together. In adequate conditions, ticks live about 2 years. So their life cycle is about 2 years long, which for an insect is actually a pretty long time. Okay, and so I know we're getting to the end of our hour. So I just want to finish up with some things about tick bite prevention. And so right now, we don't have a lot of big tools in our toolbox. We don't have a vaccination against Lyme disease, and we don't have sort of a tablet that like what we give our dogs and cats that protects us against ticks. And so for us, tick bite prevention is essentially what we need to be thinking about when we think about Lyme disease prevention. And tick bite prevention is actually prevention against a whole range of different tick-borne diseases. And so there's lots of things about being tick smart. So certainly staying on marked trails if you're outside is important. I know I'm speaking to a group of nature enthusiasts who, you purposely go into the brush and areas like that. And so essentially the reason there's that recommendation is because ticks will quest. So they come and they wait for you to have a blood meal on a lot of those brushy things. So if you're staying on areas that are well groomed and not getting into the brush, you're very unlikely to encounter ticks. And so that's where that recommendation comes from. If you are purposely going in and exploring the woods or getting into your garden and cleaning things up, there are other things you can certainly do. Covering up is really important with light colored clothing. Wearing DEET is helpful. It's not 100% effective, but it is a deterrent. There's also permethrin embedded clothing that's now available in Canada. I have seen it at Mark's Work Warehouse. It used to only be available in the United States and only for the Canadian Army. And so a lot of people would go and get it in the United States and then have it. It's quite effective. But now you can get you can get those products in Canada. I haven't seen them really widely, but I have seen them at Mark's if you are interested. And then sort of the biggest recommendation that we always have is once you're done being outside, do a really thorough tick check. Or maybe if you're outside all day, do one when you come in for a lunch break, and then do one at the end of the day. And this is, we talked about transmission time. So if we're thinking about Lyme disease, it doesn't transmit immediately. So if you're doing those tick checks, you can get those ticks off in a good amount of time, and you decrease your risk a lot. And so tick checks are essentially checking your whole body for ticks. We generally say have a warm shower as well. Shower is not going to wash a tick bite off. When they bite hard. You don't feel them, but they anchor themselves in pretty hard. But if you're having a shower, essentially you can feel around. Is there a lump or a bump that wasn't there the day before? You feel like you might have a new mole, which, moles don't usually come up that quickly. And so if you're having a shower, it's a really good way to just check your whole body for ticks. Ticks like warm, moist areas. And so they're not going to be in the most obvious spot. I like this diagram because essentially it just talks about the places that no one really likes to talk about, but those are important places to check for ticks. If you have a partner who can check your back and along your scalp, that's really helpful as well. So we're thinking warm, moist spots behind your knees and elbows is also a spot, and then along your hairline, they typically like to bite there as well. And if we're thinking about our pets, which are just as important, tick bite prevention is really important for them. And, they're less likely they're not going to wear long clothing. They're less likely to listen to us. They like to stick their heads into all the brush and root around in things. And so using a veterinary prescribed tick preventative is sort of the across the board recommendation. Your veterinarian can help you decide which one's best for you because different ones are labeled for different ticks. And they can also help you decide when you should be using them. Generally in sort of Southern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, we used to use tick prevention along with heartworm prevention for about 6 months. Those seasons are getting longer. And, we're in March right now, almost in April, and certainly the days that we've had, ticks will 100% be active right now. And so thinking about tick prevention sort of early in the spring and later into the fall is also important. Doing a daily tick check is just as important for your dogs as it is for us. And so fortunately for them, you can just turn it into a game and a really good belly scratch. A recent study that we did, we found about half of the ticks that were collected off of pets were actually on the head and ear area. So even if you're short on time, making sure you check those areas are important. If you think about it sort of logically, that's where cats and dogs are out rooting around. So it's a particularly high contact area. And then of course, the other recommendation that's similar to people, avoid tick habitat if possible. I'm 100% guilty. I have 2 dogs and, they love to go out in the woods and it's an important part of their well-being. And so when we do that, we just make sure that they get an extra good tick check at the end of the day so that we can still have that balance. So I'm just wrapping up today. Some really good resources for you if you want some more information. eTick, if you're not familiar with it, is a super fun online website where if you find a tick, you take a picture of that tick with your cell phone, you submit it online, and within 24 to 48 hours, someone's going to tell you what type of tick that is. Really helpful if you're not sure, and if you're worried it's a black-legged tick and you want to be able to go take some information to your doctor. This is a great website. We're partners. My lab is partners with eTick. We do all the tick identification for the animal submitted ticks. And then researchers at the University of Ottawa do all the submissions for the human ticks. And so it's a really great resource, especially as a lot of public health units haven't been able to take submissions the same way off of people. And so it's that nice ability to still be able to get a tick ID and know what you're dealing with. And then the Public Health Agency of Canada publishes sort of nationwide information. Public Health Ontario is where you're going to get your risk maps. So the map I showed earlier, the 2021 one will be out soon. All you have to do is Google Lyme disease risk map Ontario, and it's going to be one of the first things that pops up. And of course, your local public health unit is a great resource. They're pretty inundated right now with COVID, but they still do provide tick education and tick resources. And so the Leeds Grenville Lanark District Health Unit, the office is right there in Brockville, and they're helpful for tick information as well. And so I probably talked enough. I went over my 45 minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also happy to answer any questions over email as well.
Well, thank you, Katie. Do we have any questions for Katie today?
Katie, I'm just wondering, you mentioned dogs and horses. What about cats? I mean, they would be a carrier, but are they affected by the bacteria?
Yeah, that's a great question. So based on cats is a little bit of an understudied area, or an area where we don't have a lot of information. And so there used to sort of be a myth that because cats are active groomers, cats don't get ticks. We know that that's not true. There's been numerous studies, including a national study that my lab just did. Yeah, more of our tick submissions were definitely from dogs, but we still got a lot from cats. And so cats are certainly a risk for ticks. For tick-borne disease, it varies by the disease we're looking at. So we know that if cats are exposed to the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, they will mount an immune response. And so we can detect sort of positive exposure on our diagnostic tests. What we don't know is if that translates to any disease. We can be exposed to lots of different things, but our immune system can handle it and we don't necessarily get sick. And so we don't have very strong evidence that cats get sick with Lyme disease. And so right now, it's really not thought to be a risk for cats. That being said, black-legged ticks can carry other bacteria. So anaplasma is one of them, and cats are susceptible to anaplasma. And we do know that anaplasma is present in Ontario ticks, a lower percentage, but it has been growing. And so for that reason, we certainly still want to think about our cats with tick prevention. The one really important thing about cats is that some of the tick prevention that we use on dogs is toxic to cats. And so if you're thinking about tick prevention for your kitty cats, certainly talk with your veterinarian, because some of the over-the-counter stuff is actually really can be deadly to cats. And sometimes the labels that say don't use on a cat are shockingly small. So just making sure that you have a conversation with your veterinarian on which is best for your kitty cat. And then that will keep them safe. The nice thing is that a lot of those products also cover fleas and a variety of intestinal worms. So it's sort of an all-encompassing thing to keep your cat safe.
Anything else?
Very interesting presentation, Ambassador Clow. And
I thought I recognized your voice.
that's an inside Canadian Food Inspection Agency joke. I appreciate the fact that over the years, migratory birds have been bringing ticks into our area, and they began to survive more and more. But I'm wondering what exactly amplified the virus among small rodents. I'm assuming they become viremic for life once they're infected. And do they, is it transferred placentally? So that do they give birth to infected offsprings? Do you get intermittent feeding of or interrupted feeding of nymphs so that they go on to another small rodent and infect that one?
You have a lot of great questions in there. So the first question, what sort of
How
led
is
to
this
the
best
explosion?
maybe the relatives?
So that's sort of like a chicken and egg thing, right? And so these ticks are coming in, and how is that pathogen cycle becoming established, and what's sort of facilitating that? And there are a few different theories. One, that the ticks arrive and they're already infected. Studies have shown that not a huge percentage of ticks that actually arrive are carrying the bacteria, between 10 to 15%, which, if you think about sort of small population seeds of ticks, is that really enough to really establish a transmission cycle? We're not 100% sure. Another theory is that ticks arrive and they're not infected, and then the bacteria gets introduced at a later time. That really depends on the type of host movement that you're happening, or you see happening. You know, we have two really gigantic lakes that prevent a lot of, you know, small wildlife species from moving really actively into different areas. And so we don't think that that's a big driver here. The theory is that essentially ticks get introduced, and then over time, as that population, it might be sort of an uninfected population, but as more ticks are introduced, that some of them might be carrying the bacteria, that the population then reaches sort of a threshold that it can maintain transmission with the population, and then start to have the bacteria transmit. And so some studies have shown that we see tick populations erupt, and then 3 to 5 years later, we start to detect the bacteria, because there's that threshold that has to happen for transmission. It's a really interesting area of research, though. Some of those hypotheses have been explored in the United States, but we haven't done a lot of that research in Ontario. So if someone gives me a lot more money, I would really like to do some of those studies, because I think we see different patterns in different areas of the province, and sort of different speeds where we start to see different bacteria emerge. So it's a really interesting sort of ecological story that needs to be told. In regards to the white-footed mice, most of them do not have, like, they'll be bacteremic for a month, and then they actually can clear it. They can become reinfected, and so in high burdens, we see, you know, if ticks are feeding on them all the time, they're not going to actively clear it. So that allows for transmission to be really efficient. There's also a whole bunch that goes on with actually the timing of the life stages of the tick and when they're feeding to allow for efficient transmission. That gets really complicated, but that's sort of part of the story. And then the other thing that can happen is co-feeding. And so if two ticks are feeding very closely at the same time, near the same blood source, if one's infected and one's not, they can actually transmit very quickly without the mouse even having to be infected. Not super common, but has been demonstrated. And then your last question, I wrote a few notes about interrupted feeding. We don't think that that's a big component, mostly because ticks have, like, once they find a place to latch on, they have a whole bunch of different components in their saliva. So some like cement type things, and analgesics, so that there's no pain being exerted to the hosts, and they have anti-inflammatory stuff in their salivary glands, so that, you know, there's no immune response to them feeding. Like, they're super tricky little creatures. And so once they're there, if they don't have a reason to leave, like something pulls it off and kills it, they're usually there until they're done. Did I answer all your questions?
Yes, I just one more quick one. I'm assuming the rodents are asymptomatic. There's very little effect on them from a bacteremia.
Yep. There was one study that, and this is only one study, that showed that they might forage more. I have no idea how that would actually translate into anything. And so there's been no documented evidence that there's any kind of negative repercussion on the mouse population, which, is one reason that makes them an even better reservoir.
Right. I saw one article to that effect in a captured group of white-footed mice, but it wasn't clear, I don't think, from the research whether the organism actually caused it or it was just coincidental
Mhm.
and other infections were at play there.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Nice to
Okay,
see you.
I see Stephanie has her hand up. You want to, yeah, perfect.
Thanks very much. Wonderful presentation. If your cat or dog happens to eat an infected rodent, and my cat is guilty of killing all kinds of bugs and voles and you name it, can they pick up the bacteria that way? And if so, what are the repercussions?
So fortunately, no, because I think that would be a big risk for a lot of our furried friends. And so this bacteria is very specific to being transmitted through the tick. And so fortunately, or unfortunately, however you frame it, they're only going to get it from a tick bite. And so if it goes in through the gut, it's not going to survive that way and it's not going to be transmitted.
Wonderful. Thank you.
But that's a great question.
And I just Googled Powassan virus.
Oh, no.
That's scary.
Yeah, it is scary. We don't talk about it a lot because we don't see a lot of cases, but it is one of those things that is certainly on public health radar because when it does pop up, the cases are bad, and transmission times are quick, and so that really reinforces our need to be tick smart and really, if we have a tick on us, making sure we take it off as quickly as we can. But it's still, fortunately, it's still very rare.
Good.
Well, that's good. Well,
I have a question, Katie. You mentioned earlier about opossum. I know there's not very many in Ontario, or is there a likelihood they will be introduced to help control the tick population?
I don't think so. I hope not. I like opossums. I think they're really interesting, and where we are, I see them a little bit more often than in Eastern Ontario. I think we have enough, stories of humans messing with nature and introducing things for biological control and things going horribly wrong, that I don't think that that's particularly seen as a good solution. But it's not to say that it hasn't been proposed, and there would need to be a really comprehensive risk assessment that would have to look at sort of broad scale ecological impacts before we would want to consider something like that. So and I don't know on a local level if they really make an impact. Like, certainly they're good at killing ticks, but whether they actually do anything for a really thriving tick population, I don't think we have good evidence to suggest that.
Okay, thank you. While I'm here, I'm on behalf of the Brockville and District Horticultural Society. I'd really like to thank you very much for your most informative discussion tonight. We learned a lot for our humans and gardeners and our furry friends as well. So thank you very much. It was most enjoyable.
Well, thank you for having me. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact me.
thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
So
Hi, thank you.
Kate is free to sign off. I would like the participants to stay on for a few short announcements. Bye. So a quick report on our membership renewal blitz. We had a successful drive-through in February at the church parking lot. Then we had a telephone team who called members that had not yet renewed. After that, we had another team that delivered yearbooks and membership cards to those that were not able to come the day of the drive-through. And I must say our efforts have paid off. To date, we now have 107 out of 135 memberships who renewed. And that is thanks to Trisha and everyone who helped in any part of this initiative. So I thank you all, and I want to remind everyone that there is a tally sheet at the back of our yearbooks
Hours.
to track your volunteer hours. So if you helped with this initiative, please remember to note the time spent on page 23.
Should probably send
Our
you
handy
the
dandy
form. I
yearbook.
just have to get feedback.
And while I'm on the topic of the yearbook, I want to reiterate how this is our useful little Bible. So please keep it in a safe place so that you can refer to it whenever you have a question. The yearbook is produced by a team of 3, and we work through very tight restraints to get it off to the printers by December. So in order to meet the schedule, sometimes the sign-up information for some of the duty rosters is incomplete. So if you volunteer to help out with maintaining one of our gardens and you don't see your name on the list, please contact the committee chairs to double check your scheduled week. Write it down in your yearbook, or you can also go to the website, our shared website, where the schedules have been updated. So our next virtual speaker event is Monday, April the 26th. We have a master gardener from Ottawa who will give a talk on peonies. We will also be holding our first floral design competition. And as you know, these normally happen at our in-person meetings, but since that is not possible, we will again have a digital competition. So the details on the theme can be found on page 13 of the yearbook. And we really hope to get plenty of entries. So be creative and submit something. If you have any gardening questions that you would like to run by some of our knowledgeable members, submit them to me in writing, and we will try to address them in communiques so that everybody gets the benefit of hearing the question and the answer. So lastly, I'd like to thank the Zoom meeting team, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And I hope to see everybody next month. And do enjoy this nice weather that we've had the benefit of getting this week. Thanks.
Mhm.